this being the inauguration of a 5-year-long research project, I'm going to use my time to reframe Jennifer's important work in light of the TrafLab research project and explain why I think the regulatory allocation of liability along human supply chains should concern anyone who is interested in combating human trafficking and should be considered part of a labor perspective to human trafficking. So I'm going to introduce TrafLab. First, I'm going to say that we're going to have another event. So thank you all for coming. This is kind of a surprise that the room is full. We're going to have another one. We might be just 3 people then, but maybe you'll show up again. Professor Brishan Rogers is going to talk about minimum wage, kind of responding and thinking about the recent policy ideas to exclude migrant workers from protective employment legislation. And there's going to be a roundtable panel with Guy Mundlak, Hani Ben Israel, and Asaf Bondi. So mark your calendars. You're going to get invitations for this as well. So just so you know. Okay, back to us. So TrafLab is going to be an investigation into the causes of human trafficking and its regulation in this era of mass migration. We're going to ask the question, what are the underlying structures that sustain the market for human trafficking, and how can they be restructured? Its animating hypothesis is that first, it's the structure of labor that the root cause, it's in the structure of labor that the root causes of trafficking are to be identified. And second, that it is in the innovative regulation of the labor market that just and effective anti-trafficking policy can be devised. But first, let's say, what is human trafficking? So human trafficking is considered by many to be one of the most pressing moral challenges of our times. Contemporary definitions of human trafficking are broad. They include the experience of women, children, and men in forced prostitution, as well as forced labor, slavery, or slavery-like practices beyond or within borders. Moreover, the Trafficking Act is not just recruitment and transportation, but also harboring and receipt of persons. Finally, the form of coercion deployed is no longer just violence, threats, and fraud, but also the abuse of power or a position of vulnerability. The legal definition of trafficking under the Palermo Protocol, which is this, was enacted in some form or another of legislation in approximately 160 countries around the world. This is a human rights triumph, allegedly. We'll see why in a second, why maybe not. But the world really responded to the call to combat human trafficking. The definition, as you see it here, is quite capacious, but also frustratingly vague. So I'm not going to go into the details of the definition, but just as you can see, it has 3 parts: action, means, and exploitation. Within action, we have the idea of harboring or receipt of persons that basically makes any employer possibly a trafficker. In means, it has the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability, which anyone who ever read Marx would say any employment, any labor contract has. And exploitation that includes practices similar to slavery, not defined. Okay, so it's very vague. It's extremely vague, and for lawyers, it's both extremely frustrating, but also really creates room for innovation and for room to get a lot of what may be a concern for people interested in justice in the labor market to think about and engage with. So out of this wide range of severely exploitative situations, usually when we think about trafficking, we think about sex trafficking, but the information that we have, and this information is extremely questionable, and we can have a whole other panel about how we get to these numbers and why they're ridiculous, but kind of using the best estimates out there, which is the ILO, the International Labour Organization. It's said that around 68% of adult labor trafficking is actually labor trafficking and not sex trafficking. So that's the majority of what we're dealing with when we're talking about trafficking. Now, despite the strong global commitment to combat trafficking, And this renewed international, national, and civil society commitment to combat trafficking and the generous resources dedicated to it. And we talked about the industry of migration, but in the literature we can find discussion about the industrial complex, the anti-trafficking industrial complex. So much money goes into this, TrafLab being part of it. Lots of money that the EU gave us to think about how to combat this phenomenon. But the anti-trafficking industrial complex, there's so much money going into it, and still there's no sign that human trafficking has decreased at all, that this made any impact. And when we're looking at the numbers, again, the numbers are weird, and I'm kind of choosing here one of the one of the smaller number estimations of human trafficking, which is 2.4. Usually we talk about 20.1 million people, but I'm really trying around the world. Oh, sorry, who? Per year, but generally. So again, these numbers are sometimes are like this, but you know, again, a full panel and discussion can be dedicated to that. But if we say it's 2.4 million, again, extremely low number for the main estimation. We can say that the anti-trafficking industrial complex, including the 160 countries that criminalize trafficking, the billions and billions of dollars that are poured into this, help 3.2% of trafficked persons. How did I get to this number? The Trafficking in Persons report, the US State Department report that is annually issued, that we heard about here, that placed Thailand in tier 2 and therefore allowed for the bilateral agreement to be signed, and that did got some amazing stuff done in Israel in relation to sex trafficking. So this report, again, extremely problematic for many, many reasons, but this table is actually one of the non-controversial ones. It shows how many prosecutions, convictions, and victims identified were identified in these years in the country. Now it's a little bit small, but you can see that in 2015 it was 77,823, in 2016 a little bit less. Now note that in brackets is labor trafficking. Okay, just note how few people, and I'm not talking even about prosecutions, I'm not talking about convictions, because I'm not necessarily interested in the criminal approach, and we'll talk about that in a second, but just identified by the system. So few people were identified as victims of trafficking. So it's kind of a real question. We have all of this happening: money, goodwill, intentions, legislation, civil society, and then we have this. This research wants to make this number, make the whole situation different. That's kind of the big dream here. So what is that? I think the reason for the ineffective response lies in the reliance on criminal law, migration restrictions, and human rights-based responses to human trafficking, and a certain kind of human rights-based responses. So in the Palermo Protocol, the 2001 anti-trafficking protocol, a framework was established that's known as the 3 Ps: prevention, protection, and prosecution. This is what countries have to do in order to combat trafficking. It was adopted by the US in its own legislation, where the US made itself a global sheriff of anti-trafficking, as Janie Tran calls it. But really, out of these 3, what the world focused on is prosecution. So anti-trafficking was criminalized, and countries count how many prosecutions they have. As we saw, it's not a lot, but it's an effort. It has budgets. Prosecution is the main one. We talk about prevention as well. Prevention usually translates to border control. Mostly. I mean, there are some NGOs that are doing other work, but mostly really border control. Protection, what does it mean? Usually a really narrow sliver of human rights ex post. After you were identified as a victim of trafficking, you get a bunch of things. They're actually, I said a sliver, but it's actually quite impressive. In Israel, victims of trafficking definitely get one of the best packages that any exploited worker can get. Again, I don't want to be too cynical, but and in the US as well, T visa, you can, if you get it, not a lot of people do, but if you get it, it allows you basically a path to citizenship eventually. So, but this is protection. It's human rights for ex post for the people who got it. And again, this is 155. Since then, it was raised a number of countries that criminalize trafficking. So the current international response is really made out of border control and criminal law, and some human rights. that are kind of that narrow ex post treatment. This approach, as you can understand, totally fails to deal with economic and social conditions that create vulnerability to exploitation. The TrafLab research project proposes a shift away from this individualistic approach towards a labor paradigm of human trafficking that will supplement existing efforts. Such an approach bears the potential to reach significantly more individuals. It won't be easy to count them because it will not be criminal procedures. It will be a totally different structural approach. It will be a different labor sector, as we see happening in agriculture in Israel, at least in relation to Thai workers. The tragedy, perhaps, is that the market finds other exploitable workers, but at least where we can control it. So it bears the potential to reach significantly more individuals vulnerable to trafficking by providing them with legal mechanisms for avoiding and resisting exploitation. So adopting a labor approach to complement existing approaches would shift the focus to the power disparities between victims and traffickers and the economic and social conditions that make individuals vulnerable to trafficking in a globalized economy. This approach does not understand victims of trafficking as victims, but rather as agents of change. And it accounts for the possibility of bottom-up change that can occur only by strengthening workers' bargaining positions and remedying the structural causes of power disparities. The move to look at labor in relation to trafficking is not new, and it's not my invention. So if we look at the Trafficking in Persons report in 2008, under the what human trafficking defined, we saw a picture of a woman chained to a bed in a brothel, probably. But the world kind of shifted, at least the TIP report did, and the UNODC as well. Today in the TIP report, when you see human trafficking defined, you see this picture, right? A totally different understanding of who are people who are vulnerable to trafficking, a different understanding of what we're talking about. Yet despite this shift in understanding, the trafficking is a broad phenomenon that goes well beyond trafficking to the sex industry, the legal tools to contend with the phenomenon still didn't change. So most countries, NGOs, and others that are part of the ever-growing anti-trafficking industrial complex still didn't update the anti-trafficking toolkit to combat effectively severe and structural forms of exploitation in other labor sectors. Now, we have all these new legal instruments. The ILO that was kind of absent from the discussion, one reason being that it was terrified from dealing with sex trafficking and sex work after a 1998 debacle in the ILO about these issues. They joined the discussion and in 2014 passed the forced labor, a protocol to the Forced Labor Convention. However, reading it is a little bit disappointing. It's kind of more of the same. It doesn't do a lot more than the Palermo Protocol in offering a different approach. So this project seeks to expand our legal vocabulary, our legal imagination, and to come up with effective ways to combat severe forms of exploitation in the global economy. A labor approach to trafficking will therefore focus our attention on elements of the legal order that shape workers' bargaining power, such as labor and employment laws, national immigration laws, criminal law, welfare law, private law background rules. And its rhetoric may be less compelling. In fact, today we interviewed workers for the Workers' Rights Clinic, and anyway, it's just a note for the people here who were there. It wasn't as compelling as talking about other things, possibly. Sorry, that was a bracket. So its rhetoric may be less compelling, but attention to these elements has...
I want to know, why wasn't it compelling?
Not as much as talking about chained to a bed in a brothel. I mean, it's not the same...
Really sweet,
they're amazing, but the drama is not the same drama. Asking them, how long did you work at night? Did you get, all of these, the technicalities of it were totally different, but we can talk about that much more. So it's perhaps less compelling, but attention to these elements has the potential to fundamentally alter the conditions that cause workers' vulnerability to enable human trafficking. So given the ineffectiveness of the current anti-trafficking regime, it seems vital to reconsider the significance and potential of the labor approach for preventing trafficking and assisting trafficked persons. Adopting a labor approach for anti-trafficking therefore shifts away from individual harms and looks at power disparities between victims and traffickers and their economic and social condition. The outcome it seeks is therefore the ex-ante transformation of the economic conditions and legal rules that enable severe forms of labor exploitation, and not only individual rescue. Although the solutions offered by labor framework would necessarily be context dependent to a significant extent, varying from country to country, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all at all. Some general measures could be implemented. So ensuring that vulnerable workers have access to the justice system without fear of deportation or criminalization. This is actually the one thing that anti-trafficking regimes already try to do already in the protocols. But there are other things. Ensuring that the applicable visa regime does not formally or effectively bind workers to one specific employer, as Jennifer discussed. Regulating against work contracts and recruitment processes structured around insurmountable debt. Again, what we've been hearing here until now. Extending the application of protective employment law to sectors susceptible to trafficking. Guaranteeing the right to unionize for vulnerable workers or just to work together. I'm not talking about collective agreements here, but just some form of collective organization. Now, this list of measures is by no means exhaustive, but when operating in tandem, they can strengthen the bargaining position of vulnerable workers and provide them with the tools for transforming employment practices so as to significantly reduce instances of exploitation and trafficking. So let me just tell you what we're thinking of working on. We're thinking of working on 5 things. So one is bilateral agreements. I do not need to introduce these here now. We already talked about them. The Israeli case study is, of course, a very good one. Second is the regulation of human supply chains. I didn't have that name until I read Jennifer's piece, and now I redid the PowerPoint. But the content was there. The examples were there. Basically looking at joint employment liability of lead companies to violations by subcontractors and intermediaries. The Manitoba case that Jennifer mentions in her article and in her ILO report is a good and interesting one. And the innovation of full chain liability for all actors in the human supply chain through strict liability that still needs to be developed and further worked. So these are possible interesting case studies that we would want to understand and generalize from. National protective employment legislation. Right, I talked about the event we're going to have with Bridget Rogers about minimum wage, so this is part of that. What are the effects of the exclusion or inclusion of migrant workers in certain vulnerable and workers in certain vulnerable labor sectors from minimum wage, overtime legislation, right to join unions, etc. And how do we enforce these rights, even if they exist? So the Israeli labor market is an example that accept care workers that are excluded, as we all painfully know, and as this picture reminds us from one of the protests. But even when they apply, how should they be enforced? How are there any innovative enforcement methods in labor inspectorates, in civil society, to think about enforcing them? Unionization and organization. So collective bargaining is crucial. It can be crucial in countries where there is a strong collective bargaining background. In Israel, both the agriculture and the construction industries are such industries, although we rarely think about the Histadrut as the main union, as an actor here. But it should be, and we should think about it. But even when, not the Israeli case, in other countries either where labor unions were not interested in these sectors or where there's no strong labor activity, there's the alternative, what is called alt labor, alternative to classic labor organizations, such as the Fair Food Program of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers of Tomato Growers in Florida, which is totally non-union. It's not at all. It's kind of a mix of CSR and worker center together in a really, really fascinating way. But the European Trade Union Federation kind of picked up that that's a good idea and are trying to do something that is union-led in a similar vein, and we see it both in domestic workers in Europe beginning, some in the Netherlands already implemented, and in some other sectors as well. And finally, voluntary codes of conduct. Extremely problematic, extremely suspicious activity, but it's out there, and again, it's an industry. It's becoming an industry. Can it be garnered? Is it is it at all effective? Now, in some, when we started, I thought to focus on the corporate social responsibility of employment, of recruiters, of manpower. So that's a part of it, but of course, it's not just that, because it's expanding. So it'll be interesting to look at what it does in other sectors and in other supply chains. So one example, again, it's strongly related to the European Trade Union Federation idea, is the fair produce certificates of growers of mushrooms in the Netherlands, where apparently there's a lot of trafficking in the mushroom growing industry. And here growers, dealers, and unions joined forces in the development of a fair produce process. So all of these things can really can really teach us a lot about different ways. And one thing that's very, very exciting about our project is that we're going to do it with a laboratory of the clinical work here in the law school, the Workers' Rights Legal Clinic at Tau. I was just mentioning the interviews we did today with workers in the construction industry in Israel. Edith Zimmerman, that's over there, is the lawyer who's leading this. And here we'll be able to try and implement some of these, to promote some of these in the Israeli context. We already have some exciting ideas within the research group and are open and interested in thinking about others. So this is more or less it, and this is all just to say that I think further exploration of the human supply chain liability is this one example that, exactly as Jennifer did in her research and her talk today, is a crucial, important component of any serious efforts to combat severe forms of labor exploitation and human trafficking in this globalizing economy. And please join us for our next event. Thank you.